Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane. Words to know. Frantic, moving quickly because you're in a hurry or scared. Voyage, a trip on a ship. Deck chair, chairs that sit outside on the deck or porch. Billowed, filled with air and swelling outward. Mortified, very embarrassed. Hello and welcome back. I'm excited to read you the next 2 chapters of the Miraculous Journey of Edward Tulane. Here we go. Chapter 5. The house on Egypt Street became frantic with activity as the Tulane family prepared for their voyage to England. Edward possessed a small trunk, and Abilene packed it for him, filling it with his finest suits and several of his best hats and 3 pairs of shoes, all so that he might look his best when they get to London. Before she placed each outfit in the trunk, she showed it to him. "Do you like this shirt with the suit?" she would ask him. "Or would you like to wear your black derby hat? You look very handsome in it. Shall we pack it?" And then, finally, on a bright Saturday morning in May, Edward and Abilene and Mr. and Mrs. Tulane were all on board the ship, standing at the railing. Pellegrina was on the dock. On her head she wore a floppy hat strung with flowers. She stared straight at Edward. Her dark eyes glowed. "Goodbye," Abilene shouted to her grandmother. "I love you." The ship pulled away from the dock. Pellegrina waved to Abilene. "Goodbye, lady," she called. "Goodbye." Edward felt something damp on his ears. Abilene's tears, he supposed. He wished that she would not hold him so tight. To be held so tight often resulted in his clothes getting wrinkled. Finally, all the people on land, including Pellegrina, disappeared. Edward, for one, was so happy to have seen the last of her. As to be expected, Edward Tulane got a lot of attention on board the ship. "What a very special rabbit," said an elderly lady with 3 rows of pearls wrapped around her neck. She bent down to look more closely at Edward. "Thank you," said Abilene. Several little girls on board gave Edward deep glances, full of longing. They asked Abilene if they might hold him. "No," said Abilene. "I'm afraid that he is not the kind of rabbit who likes to be held by strangers." 2 young boys, they were brothers, named Martin and Amos, took a particular interest in Edward. "What does he do?" Martin asked Abilene on their 2nd day at sea. He pointed at Edward, who was sitting on a deck chair with his long legs stretched out in front of him. "But he doesn't do anything," said Abilene. "Well, does he wind up somewhere?" asked Amos. "No," said Abilene. "He does not wind up." "Well, what's the point of him then?" said Martin. "The point is that he is Edward," said Abilene. "Well, that's not much of a point," said Amos. "No, it's not," agreed Martin. And then, after a long, thoughtful pause, he said, "I wouldn't let anybody dress me like that." "Me either," said Amos. "Do his clothes come off?" asked Martin. "Of course they do," said Abilene. "He has many different outfits, and he has his own pajamas too, and they are made of silk." Edward, as usual, was not paying any attention to this entire conversation. A breeze was blowing off the ocean, and the silk scarf wrapped around his neck billowed out behind him. On his head he wore a straw boater hat. The rabbit was thinking that he must look quite handsome. It came to a total surprise to him then, when he was grabbed off the deck chair, and first his scarf and then his jacket and pants were ripped off of his body. he heard his pocket watch hit the deck of the ship, and then, held upside down, he watched it roll merrily toward Abilene's feet. "Look at him," said Martin. "He's even got underwear." He held Edward up so that Amos could see. "Take it off," shouted Amos. "No!" screamed Abilene. Martin removed Edward's underwear. Edward was paying close attention now. He was mortified. He was completely naked except for the hat on his head, and the other passengers on board the ship were looking at him, directing curious and embarrassing glances his way. "Give him to me!" screamed Abilene. "He's mine!" "No," said Amos Martin. "Give him to me." He clapped his hands together and then held them open. "Toss him," he said. "Oh, please," said Abilene. "Don't throw him. No, he's made of china. He'll break." Martin threw Edward, and Edward sailed naked through the air. Only a moment ago, the rabbit had thought that being naked in front of a shipload of strangers was the worst thing that could possibly happen to him, but he was wrong. It was much worse being tossed in the same naked state from the hands of one grabby, laughy boy to another. Amos caught Edward and held him up, displaying him triumphantly. "Throw him back!" called Martin. Amos raised his arms, but just as he was getting ready to throw Edward, Abilene tackled him, shoving her head into his stomach and upsetting the boy's aim. And so it was that Edward did not go flying back into the dirty hands of Martin. Instead, Edward Tulane went overboard. Chapter 6. How does a china rabbit die? Can a china rabbit drown? Is my hat still on my head? These were the questions that Edward asked himself as he went sailing over the blue sea. The sun was high in the sky, and from what seemed to be a very long, long way away, Edward could hear Abilene calling his name. "Edward!" she shouted. "Come back!" Come back? Of all the ridiculous things to shout, thought Edward. As he tumbled ears over tail through the air, he managed to catch the last glimpse of Abilene. She was standing on the back deck of the ship, holding onto the railing with one hand. In her other hand was a lamp. No, it was a ball of fire. No. Edward realized that it was his gold pocket watch that Abilene held in her hand. She was holding it up high, and it was reflecting the light of the sun. "Ah, my pocket watch!" he thought. "I need that." And then Abilene disappeared from view, and the rabbit hit the water with such tremendous force that his hat blew off his head. That answered that question, thought Edward as he watched the hat dance away in the wind. And then he began to sink. He sank and sank and sank. He kept his eyes open the whole time. Not because he was brave, but because he didn't have a choice. His painted-on eyes witnessed the blue water turning to green and then to blue again. They watched as it finally became black as night. Edward went down and down. He said to himself, "If I am going to drown, certainly I would have done so by now." Far above him, the ocean liner, with Abilene aboard it, sailed on, and the china rabbit landed, finally, on the ocean floor, face down. And there, with his head stuck in the muck, he experienced his first real and true emotion. Edward Tulane was afraid. And that's the end of chapter 6. What a terrible thing to have happened. How upset Abilene must be on the ship without her rabbit. But what I want to ask you about today is about that last sentence where it says Edward Tulane was afraid. This is the first feeling that this rabbit has ever really had. He's been annoyed some, but it says in the book that he experienced, which means he had his first real emotion, his first real feeling, and it was of being afraid. And so I want to ask you today to please do something with me. I would like you to please relate to this book, to connect to this book. I connect to this book because I can remember the very first time that I know I felt afraid. I was little. I think I was maybe 4 or 5, and I was shopping with my mother in a store called The Crescent. It's not around anymore. And we were looking at clothes, and I remember that I stopped to look at something pretty. But my mother didn't know I stopped. She kept going. And when I turned around, I didn't see her. And I was so scared because I didn't see her and I didn't know what to do, and I was too scared to call out, "Mom!" And I was too scared to run and try to find her, and so I just stood there and I started to shake, and then I started to cry, and I got lucky because a store employee, one of the ladies selling clothes, she saw me crying. She asked me what was wrong, and I told her I couldn't find my mom, and so she took me to the front desk, and we called my mom over the loudspeaker, and my mom came to find me. Everything turned out fine, but that is really my very first feeling of being afraid. So now I'd like you to please connect to this book. I'd like you to think back, as far as you can, to the first time that you remember feeling afraid. Maybe you were afraid of something, like a spider. Maybe you were afraid because, like me, you couldn't find your mom or dad in the store. Please think back on it. And if you feel okay sharing with it, I'd love to hear about your earliest memory of being afraid. Thank you for listening. Don't worry, this book has a lot more to it. The story's not over yet. I'll read you some more tomorrow. Have a good day. Bye.